Hello, my name is Lewis Talley, and welcome to today's Experts on Tap. Today's topic will be talking about the top 10 or so signs that your app server could be running suboptimally. As mentioned, my name is Lewis Talley. I'm a technical solutions architect with InSource Solutions. So we're going to try something a little bit different today. Rather than show you a bunch of PowerPoint or show you demos, I tried to put together a list of things that I thought would be helpful. And so I did that in the form of a mind map. And so the mind map is interactive, and it links to technical content out on the AVEVA support site, as well as there's some on our InSource Knowledge Center. I realize that over the years there's probably a lot of tribal knowledge that we've captured in various locations. And so my goal of today was sort of put together something that would ideally be helpful for you to look at and help you understand why you might be having suboptimal performance with your app server. As I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of moving parts with AppServer. So let's dive into the actual mind map here. So now we're looking at the mind map that covers some basic areas I thought of when putting together the content for today's presentation. And first I'd like to start with sort of the helpful locations of where I sort of gathered this. And oh, by the way, I'll make this available in the content with the PowerPoint where the links are for everything. Everything is available through the global support site from AVEVA or through our Knowledge Center. So once you have a login there, you'll have access to the same stuff that I'm showing you and talking about throughout today's presentation. So if we start with what we actually have here from a helpful locations perspective, all the stuff you can link to directly from here. So, the AVEVA support site, so you can come here, and a lot of people don't realize this is a very powerful site that you can do a lot of different stuff with. So you come here and you sign in and create an account if you're a valid customer first customer. But you could search the knowledge base. You can look for support tickets. You can see what's supported in terms of operating systems, Microsoft patches. There is a wealth of knowledge available on this website, as well as the InSource Knowledge Center. So the InSource Knowledge Center, run by InSource Solutions, is a place where all of our technical teams in various roles put together content. So I think last time I looked, I think I've published around 60 or 70 articles, everything ranging from virtualization topics to InTouch to AppServer to it's mostly not a pre-sales type thing. It would be like, hey, I found something cool. Here's a neat thing. And more about that later. Here's a neat thing I found. And so all of our technical teams all develop content and publish into that. So we've been developing this for 5 or 6 years now. And it's got quite a wealth of information in it as well. So you can come here and you can set up an account for it. You can search for things, and it's broken down by category of what you might be looking for, what you're trying to do. So as I mentioned, everything that I did for today's presentation, I gathered from one of these two sites, and I'll try to add sort of color commentary where I can. So in no particular order, when I'm looking at AppServer and trying to diagnose from a suboptimal performance perspective, I generally speaking try to start at the highest level. That doesn't mean that if you started someplace different in this tree that's wrong. It's just sort of the way that my brain operates, and I like to look at the PC landscape, and so understand that today's Xperts content is not necessarily version specific. I'll try to point out where things are relevant to specific versions of product, but I'm not going to talk about exact version when this feature came out or that or things like that. So I'm going to speak more general, more high level, but give you some specific things to look for that I think that are important, that I see in my job function routinely, as well as when I work with our clients from a tech support perspective, things our support team sees as well. And so, again, these aren't in any particular order, but these are just things, hints for happy living, if you will, things I like to look for. So I like to start with the antivirus exclusions list. You'd be surprised. There's lots of places I see where they may think they have antivirus exclusions in place. It may be at the corporate level, but it might be not the correct definitions. It might not be pushed down right. So if you want to see the actual what we call out for, for all the various antivirus exclusions. This particular one is centered around 2020, so when you link to it, it tells you what to look for from a version perspective. There's different ones for different versions. Now, I'm not going to go through and read all of this to you. So this would apply if you're using any sort of virus protection software, McAfee. In a perfect world, we understand you're not going to be able to turn that off. But if you do have to have that on, you definitely would want to add some exclusions here. So where have I seen where that can cause problems? So specifically with AppServer, it can impact our checkpoint process. More on that later. So if the virus protection software happens to have I think it's a CKP is the file extension. If it happens to have that file open, when we're trying to write values to that checkpoint, it can cause problems. I've seen those checkpoint files become corrupt before, which causes a whole bunch of problems. I've seen antivirus exclusions interfere with history blocks for the historian. So as a good rule of thumb, it's a good to go here. And I'm showing you this because I probably send this to customers lots and lots of different times. And you can generalize it. And if I'm having a general conversation with a client, I might say, exclude everything ArchestrA, everything Wonderware, everything AppServer. Obviously, that's an overgeneralization. If you want the exact, you can come here and you can look at this right here. So we'll start with that. And then next thing I like to do is sort of get the lay of the land of how the technology is deployed. Believe it or not, starting with logs can be a very helpful thing. So you have Windows logs, and depending on your flavor and vintage of Microsoft Windows, you can access that from lots of different ways. You can right-click on the Start button and select Manage and get into it that way. Or like I said, there's lots of different ways to do it. So what I'm looking for there, I'll generally go through the application, the security, and the system logs, just to kind of get a sense of what's going on with the PC. You'd be surprised. I was teaching a cloud-based class and some of our older technology, and I happened to log in and look at the Windows system, the Windows security log, and I noticed that it was being flooded with audit failures. And what was happening was an attempted denial of service attack, because we have these things hanging out there on the default RDP ports, and anyway, that was causing performance problems. And so I say that just as an example of where looking at a log file can be a good diagnostic tool to help. So like I said, generally, I'll look at the system, the application, or the security log. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. And then from there, I'll probably start in the Wonderware log files after I go through the PC log files. And so those that can be accessed in a number of different ways. It's through the system management console, the SMC, the system platform management console, depending on what your vintage of software that you're using. But it's the Wonderware logger, right, is what we lovingly call it. And so you can expand it out, and you can go into the default group there. If you have AppServer where you have Galaxy deployed, it will also add those remote nodes. A lot of people don't know that, but from one place you can sit and diagnose and see errors, warnings, and info. And again, I probably use this as, let's go check the temperature of the system, right? You'd be surprised. I've logged into customer applications before and seen things like messages being written saying the hard drive is full or filling up, and that can cause problems and things like that. As I mentioned, there's a lot of moving parts here. So that's from a high level, antivirus exclusions, stuff like that. And then I'll start to dig into how optimized is this deployment. Now, we could probably spend all of the rest of the topic just talking about this. Recognize I've got other places to go, so I'm going to try and zoom through this a little bit quickly. So out of order here, I like to start with the power settings. You'd be surprised how many places I find where the PC power settings can cause problems. And so what I mean by that is, like my laptop, for instance, has power settings that idle the hard drive or throttle back the CPUs or can put the network adapters to sleep. And that's perfectly okay from I'm in a business environment, I'm running Outlook, but if I'm running supervisory control and data acquisition software. I don't want to have that happen. And so what I'll generally do, and it's different depending on the version of the operating system you're using. I've noticed Windows 10 tends to be more green, if you will. So it's going to have, some throttle back stuff in there and some stuff like that. And so my guidance there is just pick a plan that's high performance. What you don't want to have happen is you don't want to be limiting the clock speed of your processors. You don't want to be idling your hard drives. You don't want to be putting to sleep your network adapters, especially if you're in an AppServer environment where you're using redundancy and things like that. So just be aware of that. And then next we would look at the SQL Server. So everybody knows that AppServer has a component to it associated with SQL Server. That's called the Galaxy repository node. Depending upon how your application's set up, remember, AppServer can scale down as small as everything installed on a single computer, all the way up to a very widely distributed multi-million IO application that's very, very large, right? And so interestingly enough, the same version of SQL Server would support both of those. And so the difference between the two, obviously, is how that's put in and how it's tuned and how it's managed and things like that. So there's some pretty good documentation available. I linked to this Optimizing SQL Server for a Large Galaxy Migration. Again, not going to go through all this. You can read through it. There are some different versions depending upon which version of SQL Server you're using on best ways to install SQL Server for the type of SQL Server. In general, you're going to want to do things like set up your transaction log sizes and restrictions, set up some memory clamping, and some of this, again, is version specific because some of it is handled for you in newer versions. These are just some things to be aware of. What I found, what most of our clients will do is, generally speaking, they'll put the software in and just click next, next, next. And for the most part, that's fine. But if we're trying to squeeze every bit of performance out of a perhaps suboptimal system, these are the types of things that we'll want to do. And you can go in our Knowledge Center and look for things like how to best set up your SQL Server if you want to split it out on multiple drives and put your database files on one drive and your log files on the other drive, etc. So again, not going to get into all that here, but all that's out there available for you as well. So this is probably a good place to start. And then, I like to keep abreast of the deployment guides. So back to Optimize here. The deployment guides are available a number of different places. Here's one here that's sort of, again, we could probably spend a ton of time just talking about this. This is a checklist guide that sort of is organized into areas around communication, security, administration, redundancy, migration capabilities, and things like that. I probably could have just done a video just on this. A lot of times I'll get asked, what's a good place to go? Where do I start? And this is probably what drove me to put this together. This is probably a good place that you can collect some generalized information. And some of this is not really relevant today. Hyperthreading is not that big of a deal for us in modern versions of technology. In older versions of technology, it was very important. So you could take this with somewhat of a grain of salt if you're using 2020 R2. If you're running an older version of AppServer, that's very important. In either case, things like time synchronization are extremely important to us for a number of different reasons, for a number of different technologies. So this deployment guide outlines all of this, how to deal with if you're using IPv6 or multiple network adapters. You'll see some overlap here. There's also some stuff about antivirus software. So just, you can link to here from some of the other tech notes and things like that. So I thought this was a good one to just sort of show you, what's out there. So let's see. So that gets us through general PC settings here. We covered helpful locations. Let's get into deployment. So one of the probably more common things that I see in terms of failures and slowness are, hey, when I'm deploying an object, it's slow or won't work, or when you click the little deploy button there, you get that little dialog box. And when I'm teaching an AppServer class, I always tell people this. When you click deploy, what shows up there in that deploy status dialog box is not stateful information. So when you click close, it goes away, right? If it generated an error, it'll throw the error to the log file. But a lot of times that tells us a lot of information. So for instance, if you try to deploy an object that's in a warning state, it'll deploy. If you try to deploy an object that's in an error state, it will not deploy. So you might be expecting an object to be deployed. It's not deployed. It's in an error state. That dialog box will tell us that. So those are the types of things I'm talking about. So when I think about slow deployments, when you think about what the deployment operation is, I'm linking here to a tech note that talks about the different types of scripting that we can have in the application server environment. And I'll talk more about scripting here momentarily, but when you have deployments that are slow, oftentimes what's happening is you see excessively overused startup or on-scan scripts, because what happens is that when the objects execute, they come on scan unless they're overridden default by area alphabetically. And so if you have an object that's firing all those scripts, that takes time with the deployment. Well, anyway, so that can cause problems. So some of that stuff is talked about here in this. I'm not going to go through all that in the interest of time here. And then, deployment failures. What are some common things that can cause deployment failures? I'd say probably the most common thing I see is misconfigured network adapters in a machine that has more than a singular adapter. So in older versions of operating system, we call that setting the network binding order, which is just when the operating system sees more than one card, this is the order that it searches the cards in for whatever destination it's trying to find. And in more modern operating systems, we call it the interface metric. So this talks about that. That's not to imply that that's the only reason why that we have failures and things like that. These are just probably more common things that I see. And so that's why I left that in here. So let's see here. That's deployment, scripting. I see lots of heavily scripted applications, and that's perfectly okay. Don't mean to imply that excessive scripting is bad. It's just you want to make sure you sort of know what you're doing. So I had an application one time where I had so many scripts, in fact, that I had to write a query that queried the Galaxy repository database to produce a list of all the unique scripts. So it was above 75,000 unique scripts in the Galaxy. I'm not talking about lines of code. I'm talking about scripts. And it ran fine. That's okay. So I developed some what I thought were useful queries to be helpful in AppServer. So as an example, if I wanted to query the Galaxy repository database and see what are the names of the scripts for the object, or how many scripts are there? You can see all the stuff here. But basically, so this tech note sort of walks you through how to do all that, and you fill in the blank with whatever you're looking for, just as a useful thing, because it could be helpful to see, what are the names of the scripts that might be causing your problems. And another big one I see is, so that if we understand how the execution of objects work in AppServer, it's helpful to think of a clock that might be hanging on the wall that has a second hand. And so it's sort of completing a complete revolution around the clock in 60 seconds. So the engine scan is doing that too. It's not taking 60 seconds, but it, depending on a version, is either taking 1 second or is it taking a half a second. So in that amount of time, it's doing a whole bunch of stuff, right? So it's reading all the inputs, it's executing all its internal logic, including checkpointing, housekeeping, things like that, executing any scripts that you might have on objects, and then it's writing any outputs, and then the rest of the time it's spent idle sort of reading queued up inputs. And so there's more on that in a little bit, the life cycle of an engine, if you will. But at any rate, so if you have lots of objects and they're doing lots of things through scripting, the engine will wait. So a script that's a synchronous script will sit there and wait for its execution to complete. So there are certain things that you might do from a scripting perspective that you can't tell me how long that they'll take, right? They're non-deterministic. It might be, I want to call a web service, and the time it takes to complete that call depends on the payload size. Or if I'm querying a database through ADO.net, it might take 200 milliseconds, or it might take a second to return, a giant record set that I have to iterate through or something like that. And so anyway, So you can do things by like marking a script asynchronous. And what that tells the system that you're doing is when you hit an asynchronous script, the engine doesn't wait. It's not a blocking process. It spawns off a lower thread. It spawns off an additional thread of lower priority, and the system will continue to execute. So it's not waiting for you. So this talks about that. The thing to be aware of here, and why I specifically put this one in here, I did see there's a queue on the engine. So think of you get in line at your favorite restaurant, and that's a queue, right? So the last person comes in, and the first person comes out, and they go up. So there's a queue. That's called a queue data structure. So there's a queue in the engine that by default has 10 things in it, and those 10 things are the number of currently executing asynchronous threads on the engine. So what happens when the 11th one hits? It's got to wait. So I had a customer application one time where they had marked a whole bunch of scripts asynchronous, and what had happened was their scripts were sitting there waiting because there was just so many of them. So just be aware of that. All right, moving along. Redundancy. This is probably one of the things I see quite frequently with respect to suboptimal performance is redundancy and being able to fine-tune those settings. AVEVA did a great job of creating a tech note that talks about various sizes. And so what I'm talking about there when I'm teaching this in the training class, I say, we click a checkbox for redundancy, and oftentimes it's a little more complicated than that. But if you're less than 5,000 IO, it's set up for what we think will be the defaults for you. And so without going into every single one of the things there, it's sort of optimized for small-ish applications. And so, as you grow, as your application grows, as you get more IO, things might take more time to fail over. The network might become more congested when you're failing over and you have to rebind all of your IO depending on how things are set up. You might want to enhance or delay the amount of time that it waits and things like that. So anyway, so this tech note talks all about things like that. And my guidance here is if you find yourself in a situation where you have performance problems that you suspect are related to redundancy, I'd say let's work through that with tech support. Sometimes it's not always good to just go blindly making changes to those settings. Okay, so let's talk about app engine health quickly from a performance perspective. So back to my example earlier where I talked about the clock hanging on the wall. That's your engine scanned, right? And so that's a deterministic process, runs as a Windows process. You're guaranteed that if it's a 2017 or older, it's 1,000 milliseconds. If it's newer, it's 100 milliseconds. You're guaranteed it's going to execute that consistently every time in that time. If it's not, that could mean an indication there's something going on. And that something going on could be any of the things I talked about. It could be a poorly written script. It could be you're querying a web service and the payload is bigger than what you expect and the script is timing out. It could be the virus protection software has some of our internal file systems locked when we go try to checkpoint a file. So anyway, so scan overruns are just that. I was supposed to do this in a second, and for whatever reason at 1,002 milliseconds, I said I couldn't do it. I kicked out execution. Right? You see them typically, you see scan overruns when you have deployments, if you have a lot of on-scan startup scripts and things like that. And what I tell people is if your scan overruns are less than 5%, that's okay. It's not ideal, but it's not a horrible thing, right? There's going to be drift in the system. There's going to be things that happen. There's going to be, when this process spikes up and eats our CPU that we need. Right, so if it's less than 5%, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Unless you're having other problems, this can be an indicator of other problems. And so again, we could probably spend 20 minutes just talking about the things to look for the overall engine perspective. But scan overruns is a good place to start. If you see consecutive scan overruns, that's really bad because that means that for more than one cycle in a row, I couldn't do what I was supposed to do in the time I told you that I was supposed to do it, the scan period. And then lastly, from a performance perspective, checkpointing. Now, this is not as big of a deal in more modern versions of product, I'd say post 2014 and newer. So remember, the scan process here, part of the internal housekeeping is that certain attributes that are calculated retentive or higher, that are not extended for I/O, are written to a checkpoint file. And what that means is, in the event of not using redundancy, if I were to pull a power cord on an object server and put it back in, when that thing boots back up, it's going to read that checkpoint file for its last known good value. And so that process, that writing that file, that process that the engine writes to that file can be time consuming. Now, in older versions of the product, we tried to do that as fast as we could. And so there's actually a setting in the engine that controls that. And I think, don't quote me on the version, but I want to say in around 2014, R2 maybe, we changed the default from, the default was 0 to, I think we changed it to 10,000 milliseconds, which is once every 10 seconds it will attempt to write that checkpoint file. I've found that 10 is probably a pretty practical thing. You can tune that. I've done pretty extensive testing when it first came out, and there's a point of diminishing return. 10 seconds is the default now. You're probably pretty good there. So this tech note talks about that and what types of things you could expect to see. And then lastly, let's talk about I/O communications. So starting here at the top, one low-hanging fruit, quick, simple, easy, I see a lot of people don't do is staggering their topic or scan group update intervals at prime numbers. And so probably, again, we're looking at suboptimal performance here. If you're not having any problems, you don't necessarily need to do this. If you're having problems, I'm not saying this is going to fix everything. This is just one of the things. It's like tuning a race car. We care about the air pressure in the tires. It's kind of like that, right? And so what that ensures is you never have staggering I/O updates that'll happen on top of each other. So less important in Ethernet control systems. We saw it more importance when it was serialized or, a proprietary bus like Data Highway Plus, Modbus Plus, something like that. And then, so this was a neat little feature that I don't remember exactly which version it brought out, but it was called Advanced Communication Management. And so you may or may not be aware that prior to Advanced Communication Management, all topics in AppServer were set to advise all the time, which basically means it added tremendous potential load on your network. And so if you think back to the InTouch days, an access name can be either set for advise only active items or advise all items. And so that was, to AppServer, what that behavior was for InTouch. And so Advanced Communication Management allowed us to control on a per topic basis if we wanted to advise only active items. And active items are things that are used in a script, historized, alarmed, used in an animation. I might be forgetting one more there, but anyway. It acts more like the advise only active items and less like the advise all items, so thereby decreasing the load on your network. Now, I have seen this cause problems. I have seen this fix problems. If you're having problems that are related to stale I/O, turn this off. So this is, depending on when your Galaxy was created, this may or may not be turned off. This is a Galaxy level setting. So you go in the Galaxy menu, configure, I think it's called Communication Management or Advanced Communication Management. You can search the help file for it. But there's a tech note for it that talks about it too. Now, I'm not implying that it's bad. There's a lot of variables that come into it. So Galaxy Configure Communications Management. But like I said, if you're seeing stale I/O, and stale I/O manifests itself like this, you open up Object Viewer, your timestamps aren't changing, that could be an indication that Advanced Communication Management is causing a problem, so we might need to turn that off. So be aware it's going to require a platform restart to turn that off, but that tech note talks about what ACM is. And then lastly, a lot of folks aren't aware that several versions, maybe 5 or 6 versions back, at the engine, there's a setting in the engine called read-write interrupts. And what that allows us to do is to increase or decrease the scan time of an app engine that's hosting DI objects. So the net effect of that is if you think back to the circle where the clock on the wall, where I'm reading inputs, doing my housekeeping, writing outputs, reading queued inputs, there's these message pumps that get put in here that sort of inject I/O out to field devices. So what that allows us to do is be interrupt driven with our I/O instead of having to do it once per scan. And it's configurable. When you turn it on, I want to say that by default, you get 5 and you can tune it. So anyway, that concludes all of the things I thought might be just important from a high level perspective. Again, I said I make all this stuff available. So if you have questions, certainly feel free to email us. My contact information is there at the bottom of the screen there. And I want to thank everyone for taking time today to attend this, and I hope you have a nice day. Thanks.